Okay, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Eastern Western Learning Connections. Tonight is our fourth policy information session. Our Vice President, Ian White, will be facilitating this session. We will talk about privacy policy. Ian joined our board as the Vice President, but he is the president of CCB Toronto Visionaries. That's Canadian Council of the Blind, national nonprofit organization for blind people. And the Toronto Visionaries is the chapter in Toronto. I met him at CCB and very much inspired by his leadership. A great person. Yeah.
Making me blush now.
He helped us draft all these policies and is doing a great job in facilitating all these discussions. Welcome everybody and thank you for joining us. I hope you can share your observations or perspective, or if you have any questions, just raise your questions. Feel free. It's the discussion that make this kind of information session really lively, helpful to each other. So now it's all over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Yang. Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. I wanted to just reemphasize what Yang was saying about the fact that the discussion is helpful. These policies are meant to be sort of guidelines for our organization, East and West Learning Connections. And we at the board have taken sort of steps to put these policies in place. But we freely admit that we are not experts in the field. We are simply volunteers doing the best we can to put in place policies that we feel will help clarify what kinds of behaviors are expected and what people coming to the organization can expect from us. So that's really what the policies are meant to do. And as such, they're living documents. They're not cast in stone. They are working documents, and they will evolve over time. And the evolution that they go through will be dependent on discussions like the one we're having tonight. It's always interesting to get new perspectives, to have assumptions challenged and either defend those assumptions or analyze them in another light to make the policy even better and stronger. And by sort of implication, the organization that we're all part of that much stronger and better. So please do engage with the material. Feel free to ask questions, and we'll do our best to answer them as we go through. So what I'd like to do in broad general terms is do a little bit of a sketch of why maintaining some sort of approach to privacy is important, and what most of the privacy policies that you'll see out there are based on, and then go through the policy itself, sort of section by section, and talk about what each section is for, what it means, what the various provisions in the policy mean, and then I guess field as many questions as we possibly can. That would be ideal. So what I'd like to do is start by letting you know that the text can be found on our website, eawlc.org/privacy-policy. So if you wanted to call up the actual text and review it as we're going through, that would be fine. So we're a registered not-for-profit corporation. And what that means is that we're bound by a series of bits of legislation, one federal, one provincial, and some other related legislation as well. the Not-for-Profit Corporations Act actually refers to privacy as one of the things that an organization needs to be aware of and needs to deal with. And the legislation that is in force here in Ontario is the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. And again, that's freely available on government websites. The text is rather long and complicated and involves several sections. The one that we're most interested in is Section 3, which pertains to the protection of personal privacy. So that's sort of the legislative landscape. What is privacy? What does it mean? According to the policy that we have, which was largely taken from a published policy at the Ontario Trillium Foundation and has been compared to a number of other policies as well. Privacy is defined as it's the principle that an individual has the right to control their own personal information. And really, that's the upshot of it. That's the essential point that we're trying to get at is your personal information is yours to deal with as you choose, right? So everything that we do that concerns your personal privacy is yours to control. It's yours to divulge or not. And you have a right to know what's being done with it. So really the essential thing that is fundamental to all aspects of this policy is that there's a certain consent required by you to initially divulge your personal information, and then for us to take that trust seriously. So that as we have a duty of care to the organization, we have a duty of care to that information, which needs to remain private unless you consent to our disclosing it. There are some exceptions to that, and we'll get to those as we go through the policy. What is personal information? So it's basically any information that can be tied to an individual. It's anything that is personal to them. It is their phone number, their address, anything about them physically or medically or even socially. So what personal information entails is it's really anything that it's anything that can be tied back to you as an individual. So, for example, we've just gone through a round as people were joining the call this evening of saying hello to people and asking for their names. Well, your name is part of your personal information, and you have the option to disclose that or withhold it. Withholding it doesn't sort of go well socially, but it is actually something that identifies you as an individual. It's not necessarily exclusive to you in the sense that there could be other people with the same name. I happen to be one of those people who has the same name as a famous hockey player. And I wish I had his income, but I don't. But even something as simple as that can be considered personal information, and it can be something that ties other bits of information back to you. Many of the kinds of information that are often disclosed or shared with an organization are things that are covered under the Human Rights Code in Ontario. Often when signing up for various government programs or putting applications into employers, you'll be asked for things like your age, languages spoken, anything that could trace you back to your point of origin, your marital status, your even things to do with criminal record or your receipt of public funds. So all of those things are specifically pointed out in the Human Rights Code as areas where you can't discriminate against a person, But there are also things that are often cited as points of personal information that need to be protected in order to protect a person's privacy. What is the piece of legislation that governs things to do with privacy? It's referred to as FIPA, which is the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. So what's interesting about this act is that it sort of covers two aspects of information sharing. One is the freedom of information piece, which is mostly to do with information that is held by the government. And it's held by the government on behalf of the constituents. So the government will have information on, you and your business dealings if you're a registered business. It will have information about your tax status. It will have information about your income. It'll have information that it's collected through surveys and census forms and all kinds of different things. It'll have information on your, status as a driver or not. If you're registered with the Ministry of Transportation, it'll have health information about you. And it doesn't mean that someone could apply for release of that information. That's not the kind of information that can be released, except under extraordinary circumstances. But it's more to do with being able to access information about decisions that are made with respect to government. If there is information surrounding a particular political appointment or the financial solidity of a crown corporation, there are applications that can be made to release that information because theoretically it is part of the public trust. There are certain kinds of information that the government will not release because it bears on national security. But barring sort of a case to be made that the releasing of that information would jeopardize something like national security, the government is actually required to release information to the public about most of its dealings. And I think that's actually quite cool. The other piece of it has to do with the protection of personal privacy. And that's where we get into sort of the mix of it. Really, the fundamental idea of the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act is that the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information is regulated. So there is actually law in Ontario that says thou shalt not do certain things with respect to personal information. So let's go through those three just in a little bit of detail. With respect to collection, I'm going to sort of drop down into sort of what is required for the East and West Learning Connections organization to be able to function. So in order for us to be able to communicate with our members, we need a certain amount of personal information on how to contact you, right? We need your name, we need your mailing address, because one of the provisions in our soon to be published bylaws says that we have to give notice in writing of an upcoming general meeting of the membership, because the membership is involved in governing the organization and everybody has to be notified that there's a meeting coming up so they can participate in that. If you have an email address, we'll ask you for that. Because again, we have a provision in the bylaws that saves us stamps and printing. So we can actually notify you of meetings by email. We would probably ask for a telephone number in case we need to contact you in an emergency situation or to otherwise notify you. Those kinds of things are the kinds of things that we would ask for. There are other things as well, but the idea is that in order for us to be able to function as an organization, to do the things that we're promising to do in our articles and in our bylaw and in our mission statement, we need a certain amount of information from you in order to make that work. And So the relationship that we set up is that we ask you for that information. We tell you what we're going to do with that information. We provide you with some sort of contact point so that if you have questions about what the nature of the collection is all about, you have an opportunity to find that out. And basically, we take into trust that information, and we basically make a pact with you that we will not unnecessarily disclose or share that information with anyone without your consent. And I think that's really the key phrase, without your consent. Just about everything that I've been able to read about privacy policies and within the Act itself, and certainly within the policy as it's stated, you'll find the word consent occurs quite often. It's really just that. You have ultimate control of your personal information. And so if you're going to share it with someone, you need to consent to doing that. And you need to consent to the use being made of that personal information. So you need to understand what use is going to be made and provide your consent accordingly. So really, it's just about us being able to fulfill our mandate by collecting the minimum amount of personal information we need in order to operate and to fulfill that mandate. Now, you have the option to withhold that information, but it means we might not be able to actually connect with you as a member if you decide not to disclose that little level of personal information, because we would not be able to fulfill our mandate if you did withhold. So I think the other thing that's really important is that we only collect the information that's necessary for us to function. One of the things that both the Ontario Human Rights Code talks about and FIPA talks about as well is that you're only really justified in asking for information that you need as an organization in order to fulfill your functional duties. And for example, we're never going to ask you for your blood type. It's just not going to happen because we don't need that information. We're not a medical facility. We don't have anything to do with medicine. We don't have anything to do with the Ministry of Health. So I can't ever imagine a situation where we would need to know your blood type. So we would not be justified in asking for that, right? That's, I think, what is meant and intended by this notion of only asking for the information that you need, only being justified in collecting information that is vital. So I want to draw a quick distinction between use and disclosure. This is something that sometimes gets mixed up. So the way I understand it, use is typically internal use by the organization. It certainly is in the way that it's construed here. We as an organization, I don't think would have any interest in sharing any personal information of our members with any other organization or other body. So the use that would be made of personal information would be sort of well restricted by our mandate and our bylaws. So, for example, we might use the contact information that you provide us to add you to our email list so that we send you notifications of upcoming events, right? That is part of our mandate. That's part of what we do. And in agreeing to have your email listed on our distribution list, again, your consent, that allows us to fulfill part of our mandate. If we were to hold some kind of an event and someone, say, connected with you, a friend or family member, was somehow injured or became ill, we would want to be able to contact you quickly. And so we would use the information that we've gathered in terms of phone numbers or emails or texting or however we get a hold of you to contact you and let you know that there's a medical emergency. Those kinds of things are exactly why we need to collect information and the kinds of uses we would make of it. So these are internal uses. There would be sort of disclosure back and forth between people who are authorized to handle that information. And I think that that's where it becomes a little confusing between use and disclosure, because disclosure can be internal or external. And it's distinct from use in that to use information is to sort of facilitate some part of your sort of working structure, your mandate. It's an execution of your role as the organization. Disclosure is who has access to that information, to whom is it disclosed. And as I said, that can be either internal between, for example, board members. If there are individuals who are in charge of programming, they might have access to the membership list and its contact information when setting up programs. There certainly, once we have a volunteer coordinator in place, we would be asking that person to handle the taking of information and the adding it to our database. So there would be a certain amount of sharing of information that has to happen. And in order to secure information, it has to be held in at least more than one place. One of the obligations under the policy is to make sure that we ensure that that information doesn't get destroyed. And one of the things that can happen, as many of you already know, is that if information is sitting in one place on one computer drive and something were to happen to that computer drive, that information is gone. So again, in terms of sharing information, we have an obligation to take the minimum necessary steps in order to safeguard the information by storing it in at least two places. So again, there's a certain amount of internal information sharing that has to go on in order for us to fulfill our obligations. Where a lot of people get excited about disclosure is where the disclosure becomes external, where it goes outside of the organization. And that is really something that you've probably heard in the news, where organizations have either been hacked or they have sold information to a third party for basically commercial purposes. And that's something that both the privacy policy and the regulations strictly forbid. So it's really not part of our intention to ever engage in that kind of disclosure. Certainly accidents can happen. We do what we can in terms of setting protocols to mitigate and minimize the possibility of accidental disclosure. But again, these are things that we're working through as we're sort of getting our organizational ducks in a row and getting our administrative policies and procedures in place. So I've kind of gone through where disclosure is improper. So it's really where the disclosure becomes problematic is when the use is outside of our mandate. If we were to use that information that you had entrusted us, use personal information in a way that was clearly outside of our core mandate, as it's stated in our articles and as set up in our mission statement, then a challenge could be made to say, hey, you're not using the information that we gave you properly. Certainly, any sort of public disclosure of personal information is not a good idea. And the sale of membership lists to third parties to use for marketing or sales purposes is not allowed either. Any sort of publishing of personal information, whether it's on the web or through social media or anything like that, is not allowed within the remit of the policy. So what I'd like to do now is just walk through the policy just very quickly. It's fairly straightforward. It's laid out in 4 simple parts. The first part really is the rationale. It just basically states that we want to respect privacy rights, and we'll strive to protect the personal information that's entrusted to us. And that's really all the rationale says. 2.0 is the purpose. And essentially what that does is it suggests that we're aligning this policy with the requirements under FIPA. And particularly in part 3, the protection of personal information. 3.0 is the actual guts of the policy itself. It's sort of outlines exactly what we're going to do and how we're going to handle information. So the first bullet there talks about only collecting what is necessary. And I've talked a little bit about that. And it talks about the requirement that we need to inform people about why we're collecting the information and how it's going to be used, so that they have a reasonable expectation of what use will be made of their personal information and how far we can go in exercising our control of that information. And again, there's a sort of a stipulation saying that this is all based on your consent, right? You're consenting to give us your information so that we can use it in the ways that we've said. And it also stipulates that we need to provide access to a contact. And we'll talk about that just a little bit further down. So again, it stipulates that that information will only be used in the ways that are outlined, and that is that you've given your consent for us to use that information in that way. So it's not that we can use the information for any purpose at all. We can use it either for the stated purpose or for what's called a consistent purpose. And the consistent purpose, as it's defined both in FIPA and in our policy, is that if the use being made of the information is something that you as an individual could reasonably expect us to do, even though we haven't stated specifically that we're going to use the information in this particular way. But if it's completely reasonable to think that if we had this information, we would use it that way, then that's a consistent purpose, right? So when I talk about, working within our mandate, working within the general sort of prescriptive structure of the other policies, respecting the information that you're giving us and the trust that you're sort of placing in us to use that information for activities that relate to EAWLC, then those are all consistent uses of the information that we're provided. What are the types of disclosures that can be made under the legislation under FIPA Part 3? We can disclose information if you allow us to, if you give us your consent. We can disclose information for a consistent purpose if it's, again, within what is reasonable to expect based on our stated objectives and our stated purposes. We can disclose it internally, as I mentioned earlier, to those in the organization who need access to that information in order to fulfill their duties. There are certain disclosures that we cannot refuse under law. So, for example, if the police are making an investigation and they require us to disclose information, we are bound by law to do that. That's not something that we can sort of say, well, you know, that information is private, you can't have it. When the police asks, you kind of have to give them what they're asking for. Now, there's a whole process behind that I can talk a little bit about. I'm not super clear on it, but it's not just that they can sort of waltz in the door and ask for all your information. They have to have a specific reason for asking. They have to have it cleared by a judge. They have to follow a certain procedure in order to justify their request. So there's a whole sort of backstopping process there that has to do with disclosure to police. We can also disclose information to preserve someone's safety if we need to contact them for some reason that has to do with their personal safety. And again, one of the things that's talked about in the policy is compassionate circumstances. And that basically just talks about what I was speaking of earlier, which is, you know, if someone has had a medical emergency or something like that, we need to be able to contact the people they know so that they can be cared for. So we would be able to disclose in that situation. And those are really the major areas where we're allowed to disclose information. Other than that, we need to do as much as we can to try to make sure that the information stays private. Who's responsible for ensuring that privacy? The way we've structured our code of conduct, which we dealt with in the first information session, is that we've set up what's called an ethics executive. And the ethics executive is essentially the organization president, or in their absence, the organization's vice president, or in their absence, it's basically the entire board of directors. So the ethics executive is really those people who are most entrusted with governance in the organization, who are most highly privileged when it comes to access to information, and have as much information as it's possible to have about all aspects of the governance of the operation in order to make judgments about when and how to disclose information. So really, it's the responsibility of those individuals to make sure that we as an organization are managing private information appropriately and maintaining protocols when it comes to privacy of our members. So the disclosure of personal information is limited to those who need to know. And what that means is that, so if I am a volunteer at one of our events and I'm responsible for, you know, handing out the snacks, I don't need access to the full membership list and all of its personal information. I just don't need that to do my job, right? If, however, I am responsible for allocating which volunteers take on which responsibilities at that event, I might need access to that information because I might need to be able to make judgments about who can assume authority, who can have access to other kinds of information or can handle financial matters at that meeting. There might be things that I would need to know in order to intelligently and responsibly designate volunteers to certain roles. So in that situation, I would need to know that information, and that information would be disclosed to me. So we're also responsible for taking some precautions to prevent accidental disclosure or intentional disclosure, which basically amounts to a hack. We have a responsibility as an organization to make sure that we're doing what we can to protect the information that we're given. And that means thinking about how the information is stored, how it's handled, how it's managed, how it's transferred. There are organizations that I'm aware of that will not share their membership list or any of the information on it through email because they're just concerned about the security of email. Again, we haven't gone through the process of defining exactly what our procedures are with respect to storage of information, but we will be doing that in fairly short order over the next few months, and we'll have protocols in place. The other thing is that people who have access to private information in the organization are required to sign the code of conduct and our privacy policy, among other things, in order to ensure that they are in a position of trust and that they understand their responsibilities with respect to caring for the information that they're managing. So there is, sort of another layer to setting up these policies, and it's basically to be able to communicate to people who are coming into the organization what the expectations are around the management of personal information. We're required to set up what's called a breach protocol, which is if there is a breach, if something happens, what do we do in that situation? Who are we obligated to notify, and under what circumstances? So we don't actually have a breach protocol in place yet. We're working on that. But again, it's something that is required for us to have so that if, heaven forbid, there should be a breach, we know as an organization what to do with that and how to proceed. It requires us to have a contact in place so that if there are questions about how our organization handles information that it's vouchsafed, that answers can be given. So I think based on the fact that we have an ethics executive set up where the first point of contact is the president of the organization, in my opinion, it should be the president who acts as the senior contact when it comes to answering questions with respect to privacy and personal information management. The other person who is entrusted with a good deal of the personal information at the organization is the club secretary. And so the secretary would be probably the next person who would be in a position to answer questions with respect to privacy. And really that's the bulk of the main part of the policy, Section 3. Section 4 has to do with definitions. So again, just to review these quickly, a breach is basically defined as disclosure, whether accidental or because of an intentional incursion by a third party. Control of information, to a large extent, rests with the board of directors, with the president, the secretary, and the directors and the board, who have authorization and authority to deal with all of the matters with respect to governing the organization. So they are the people who need access to as much information as possible and are responsible ultimately for good governance and maintaining these policies and the requirements with respect to privacy. The definition of personal information is interesting. Goes through about eight different sections there. A lot of the first piece of that are areas that are aligned with the Human Rights Code. And in a number of cases, there are things that I don't think we will be collecting, things to do with race or ethnicity or age. Other than we will ask people if they are 18 years old or older, and that's a requirement under our bylaws for full participation as a Class A member. We have a Class B membership, which has provision for people who are 17 and younger. But the idea there is that if you're going to participate as a Class A member and you're going to be responsible for attending general meetings and helping us decide on whether to pass amendments to bylaws or replacing directors as governors, you need to be someone who is of a responsible age. So the only age question we would ask is, are you 18 years or older? Anything other than that, we don't need to know. Other kinds of personal information, address, email, phone number, those kinds of things are part of what we would need. As I mentioned at the outset, we would need that information in order to fulfill our obligations under the bylaws for notification of meetings, and to be able to engage with you as members in a fair and open manner. One of the provisions talks about medical information. I don't think there's any situation where we would need medical information unless there's a provision in the Code of Conduct that talks about disclosure of a medical condition that might impair your ability as a volunteer. And we might be in a situation, and I'll just paint a scenario here. If you as a volunteer were responsible for supervision of other volunteers and you encountered a situation where you were prescribed something by your doctor that was going to impair your judgment, we would need to know that in order to be able to redirect you as a volunteer to a position of less authority. And the reason for that is that if you're in a position of authority over other volunteers and your judgment is impaired, you're not going to be able to exercise your responsibility with respect to those other volunteers in a safe and responsible way. And we have a duty to take care that that situation doesn't arise. So that's a situation where I could imagine we would ask you to disclose a medical situation. Again, we don't need the details of the medical situation. All we need to know is that, you know, there's something going on where you're required to take a medication that's going to impair your judgment. That's all. And at that point, we have the information we need in order to fulfill our duties, right? There's a section under the personal information definition that has to do with personal opinions that, I'll be honest with you, I don't really understand. If anyone wants to look at that and give me their interpretation, I'd be happy to hear it. It's a little confusing. It has to do with people holding personal opinions about other people, and I'm not really clear on what circumstance we would be in where that would be the case. But anyway, there's a provision in there about correspondence, not disclosing correspondence that would disclose personal information, or even a response to something received that had personal information in it, if the response gives any indication that there's personal information that could be disclosed there. And the use of names, again, has to be done with consent. I know that quite often organizations will ask for consent of people who are in photographs, for example. And certainly, you know, if people are identified in those photographs by name, then consent needs to be sought. And again, just to repeat, the definition of privacy is, it's the principle that an individual has the right to control their own personal information. And with that, we come to the end of the policy as it's stated, and I happily will open up for conversation about this. It's been really interesting being part of putting these policies together. I've learned an enormous amount over the last few months about not-for-profit organizations and how they're governed. And I freely admit I don't know everything. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspectives on some of these things. Or if you have specific questions that you'd like to throw out to the group here.
Yeah, Ian, let me tell you, our volunteer members, when they fill out this application form, the information we ask for as like legal name and nickname. So the name they would like people to call them, their email address, their phone number, but this is not like email address is required. Phone number is optional for emergency use. WeChat ID for communications in Chinese, also optional. And their experience, the service they would like to provide to EAWLC, their experience, their availability, and whether they would like to be a member. So they'll just click yes or leave it blank as a gesture for no. That's basically what we asked. So we are not asking for mailing address. I think if people are okay with email, then we'll send notice to them through email. But if they don't have, we can ask for their mailing address, so we can make sure we send out notice, say for annual general meeting, to everybody, including those people who do not have an email account.
Yeah, the way the bylaw is structured is that it just requires us to be able to contact people to notify them of a general meeting, for example. And it does allow us to communicate through electronic means like email. So what that means is that if you're comfortable with us communicating with you by email for such notifications, then that's what we'll do. And if you're not, then provide us with a mailing address where we can send notification that you'll get. So all we're trying to do is make sure you get the notification. And that's actually required. We're required by law to do that. So we have to have some way of connecting with you, right? So that's really why that provision's in there. So,
and we're not asking for age, even like whether you're 18 or younger. We're not asking for that. Yeah. So,
but we may have to as the bylaw goes into effect, because there is a distinction between Class A and Class B members. So, yeah, we may need to add that in as a follow up.
Yeah. So usually when people fill out that application form, I'll talk to them. So in that phone conversation, we'll learn each other a little bit more. And I do have some questions in that regard. So it's more like a social conversation, and also this question apply to all other social setting between members, either board members with, members, volunteers. Yeah, they'll get to know each other over time, and they'll, know a lot of personal information, because the definition of personal information like includes everything from number 1 to number 8. That's everything, right? So when members socialize, and they will introduce each other, or maybe like develop as their social network.
Sure. Yeah.
So how do they do in social settings without breaching this privacy policy? Like what should people do?
Okay. So
is there any difference between within the organization, like between members, and with outside the organization, like between a member and a non-member?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So let me tie this back to something I said early on in the presentation, and that is that the first thing that people need to really grasp is that they control their personal information, and they can willingly disclose that information to anyone they choose to, right? That's not a breach of our privacy policy, right? If one member walks up to another at a meeting and says, hi, my name's Ian, and, I live in the West End of Toronto and I really love tacos. Those are bits of personal information about me that I am freely disclosing as part of that social setting, right? But I am choosing to disclose. I am consenting to the disclosure by disclosing, right? The difference between that and someone giving us as an organization their personal information, their contact information, where they live, their phone number, their email address, et cetera, is that we form a trust with them, right? Saying we will not turn around and disclose that information without your consent.
Yeah, that's for sure. Like that's very easy to understand, but sometimes
exactly
social setting,
in a social setting, people freely talking to each other and extending their social networks. That's kind of what the meetings are for. Right? So trying to put a limit on that, no, that's not what this policy is for at all. It's really talking about the relationship between us as an organization and our members, and what the nature of that trust arrangement is with respect to their personal privacy that they are vouchsafing to us and expecting us to manage in an appropriate and responsible way, right?
Because when I talk to people when they first join, so we have free chats. Well, I really enjoy it. So we get to know each other better. And then I can think of ways maybe they can, do something for the organization, for the community. Say they're where they work, what they do, kind of history, and we get to know each other more. So we can trust each other more. So I'm thinking like this kind of conversation. What should I? Well, I'm not like disclosing this like to other people, but what should I pay attention to when I conduct this kind of conversations?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good question, and it's one that comes up quite often. The idea there is that as a representative of the organization, you should only be asking a potential volunteer or member for information that is necessary to know in order for their involvement with the organization to be fruitful and meaningful. Okay. So, for example, I don't need to know how tall you are to know whether or not you would be a suitable volunteer, right? Unless there is something about the volunteer position that requires a certain physical reach or certain physical demands, right? There are certain volunteer positions that I have been told about, just as an example, where a certain amount of lifting and carrying is involved. So if you're not the kind of person who can lift and carry, then it's appropriate for me to ask if you see any problem with, lifting and carrying, in order for me to be able to place you appropriately as a volunteer, right? But the questions that are asked should be directly related to the volunteer tasks that are potentially, part of the responsibilities of a volunteer. And then the question is, after outlining what the requirements are, the question is, do you see any difficulty in fulfilling any of these duties, right? And if the answer comes,
when I talk to people, it just, we just want to learn each other, like know about each other. So there may not be a exact volunteer position there. So we just learn each other in general.
Sure.
And one of our missions is also to promote connections between people, including like board members and members, the connection. So I wish we can all be friends.
Right.
So it will be.
But there are ways to ask
talk.
those questions that that don't necessarily demand disclosure of specific information. So, for example, I could say to you upon meeting you at a gathering, right? I could say, "Tell me about yourself." What you disclose about yourself is entirely up to you. Right?
So I cannot ask any questions. That's not conversation.
Well, yeah. Tell me about yourself.
Yeah, then I blah, blah, blah. And you are not allowed to ask me any questions, show any interest in me. No, that's not a good conversation.
That's not what's intended at all. Because if you disclose certain information, I am perfectly legitimate in asking follow-up questions. So if you disclose to me that you have a history in economics, I can say, "Oh, are you a specialist in macro or microeconomics?" Right? And follow the trail that way. We can have a conversation. But again, the idea of this policy is not to prescribe conversations at that level.
Yeah. But I worry a lot,
It's really not intended to be that way. No, and disclosure about yourself is really a much more fluid thing, okay? What we're really getting at here and what the policy is meant to describe, again, really focuses on the relationship between the organization and its requirements and the people who are providing private information to that. So if you're at a gathering and you're having a social conversation, you can talk about whatever you want, whatever is interesting to you. Again, are you acting in that setting as a representative of the organization, or are you simply having a conversation with a friend?
It's kind of both. Like in my case, it's kind of both. So yeah, it's like mixed.
Yeah. So again, I think it's just about being clear and disclosing up front that, you are the president of the organization and you're interested in gathering information on potential volunteers, and can we have a conversation about that? And then you're basically setting the frame for the conversation, and the person has the option to either engage in that conversation or decline it. Right?
Good, thank you. And how about program leads and board members discuss about job responsibilities and volunteer qualifications? So they'll need to know these qualifications, which probably include educational background or experience. Those are all personal information.
Yeah. But again, in order to be able to sit on the board, you have to be in a position of trust and authority. You have to have signed the code of conduct and agreed to abide by all of the policies of the organization, including its vision, mission, values, and bylaws. And all of those documents are meant to outline how private information is to be handled, and that it's not to be disclosed indiscriminately. It is necessary for us to function as an organization that we have access to that information, especially at the board level, and especially for those who are making decisions about the deployment of volunteers. If we're to do that responsibly, we have to have information to work with. So, we as individuals in a position of trust have to be trusted to manage that information appropriately, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So Aimin, are you here?
Myself, yes, I'm here. It's a great talk. It's a great. I learned a lot from Ian. It's very you identified what's the personal information, and it's anything related to this is very. Sometimes people just have, so why you cannot tell me this? Why you cannot tell me that? Because that's all my information. What I want to tell people is my choice. So I think the on the other side, who is listening to this has to respect this. Because I think sometimes maybe it's the cultures, cultures differences. Sometimes they said, "Oh, this is not a big deal. Why she doesn't tell me? She's hiding things from me." It's not like that, you know. Yeah. Somehow we understand this. Yeah. So when you that's a different. But this is great. And one more thing is that you said this is about the agency's policy. It is not our general conversation. No. This is very important.
So, for example, just as an example, one of the things that does come up from time to time is people will request. A member will come to us and request that they want to get to know somebody, a specific person that they ran into. So can they have their contact information, please?
No, never. Yeah.
And the answer is absolutely never.
That's never.
So what we can do in that situation is take your information, right, with your consent to pass it on to the other person who then has the option to contact you or not, right? We can do that.
Yeah.
But but we can't just disclose individuals' personal contact information just because you want it. No, that isn't something we can do.
Yeah. Also, you can ask somehow you can ask a consent, and then you can disclose. But for this kind of things, never. Yeah, never right. Just say. Yeah, that's one thing. And the other things I learned from is collect whatever the agency should collect, not over collect. The personal information, and that's very important as well. So, but one thing I would like to say, sometimes we are not intended to disclosure people's information. Just to give you an example, I'm working in this field. Sometimes I got to be very cautious. So when I walk on the street, so my client waved at me. I was with my friend, right? So, and then the client waved on me and they say, "Oh, hi," and they call my names and know me very well. And then my friends will say, "Oh, who she is." So that time is very be careful. So just say, "Oh, she's one of my clients." Yep. And then people somehow, I work with people with mental illness, or I work with someone has some other issues. And then my friends will know, oh, this person has some information now, and which is what I intended unconsciously disclosure this kind of information, which is not for this organization that's serious, but for my working field is kind of has to be taken caution. I just say sometimes we are unconsciously or not intended to disclosure information. We just be aware of this.
What should you do in this case?
If she waved me, just don't say anything. You just say, "Oh, I just know these people." Just say that. You just say, "She may know me before." You don't need to say she's my client, or or I know him, or know this person in my workplace. You don't need to say anything. You just say she's. But sometimes, like in my work, I have a certain way, like especially in Chinese, right? Certain way people call me, they will guess, "Oh, this person is my client," you know. So, but because that's why what I said. So that's another example. Says when people live in a small town. Everybody knows each other, and then if I'm the social worker, it's very conflict, you know. It's very conflict. So this is an extremely case, but I don't think this agency will apply.
But even if you were to say that the person was someone you knew from work, that doesn't necessarily share much. In the sense that they could be a coworker. They aren't necessarily a client. And even if they were a client, you deal with a wide range of clients, so there's no specific thing that could be related to that individual.
Sometimes too, because like people knows even sometimes. So because actually this is exactly I have this kind of issue, and I live because I used to live close to my workplace. And then my workplace is people knows I'm working with people with mental illness. And one of my clients is chatful, and she's always walk around the street, and when she see me, she will yell out my name.
Okay.
And then you know that, and the people will guess he's a parent, something will guess what his condition, something, and then so I will just say first things I learned is I never say hello to my clients. I just pretend I didn't see anything. I have to. I learned very hard way actually.
That is hard.
Sometimes,
that's
sometimes
tricky.
Because at my first job, right? So sometimes we treat our clients very so-called nice or respect, right? So the people greeting with you, or you greeting with the people, your clients, right? So just somehow it's what we do, right? But I found out, this is kind of tricky, right? Even my husband, be careful this. Even my husband with me, right? Yeah. And then she was like, how you know this person? What I cannot disclose who she is, right? So this is it's our code of conduct part. Just not the big deal. Just I don't think this agency will commit this. I just share my experience.
Again, it depends on the nature of the information that is required for us to operate. As I said, there may be situations where we might need to know that level of detail on people if we're trying to assign them to a particular volunteer role. But in general terms, I just don't think the kind of information that we would be gathering would sort of fall in that level of sensitivity. But certainly, between the privacy policy that we have in place that prevents us from disclosing personal information that we don't have consent to disclose, and the anti-discrimination policy that we have in place that says we can't discriminate against people based on the criteria laid out in the Human Rights Code, I think, we've got a pretty solid base for being able to deal with people in a fair and respectful manner. So that's what I'm hoping.
So Amy, you have received the training on confidentiality. Confidentiality. So what do you remember? Like what points impressed you very much? Would you like to share with us some of those training?
I really don't remember what's the detail. I think Ian just said, it's a pretty clear. So one side is as an agency, what information we should collect. We collect it just enough, not over, right? And on the other side is I just emphasize it also that's unconscious disclosure, and the most important is we respect personal information, and it has to be in your heart anyway, and so just I give you another example. Like we send out, for example, we send out some invites or reminders through the group email. So we never disclose this email
it's always in BCC.
It's always right. BCC. So you're already practicing this, right? So this is kind of just the training you get is always think about just be cautious when you trade the personal information. Just be very cautious. That's good enough. Like Ian says, it's not that scary as long as you take care of well.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. I like what Ian said. Yeah, it's very clear. So I understand. Sometimes I refresh a lot. Yeah.
So do you know, Amy? Do you know what kind of measures other organizations are taking to protect their clients or privacy?
Yeah, that's like Ian just said. We never close personal information because they said, "Oh, I'm her friend," or "I have an emergency. I have to contact these people, this person." So yeah, we never disclose the information on our site. Yeah. So you can say, you can find your friends, you can say who else you know, you can call this person, or you can leave your disclosure. I can let these people know to contact you, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, that's basically is. So anyway, you be cautious. Personal information with in your hands is totally. Yeah, it's not slip down your hands. Yeah.
Yeah, I describe it as being entrusted with that information. Right?
Yes.
And that's sort of how I like to think about it. Like we as an organization are being trusted with something that is personal and private.
Yeah. Well, one more thing that I would say.
You need to respect that.
Yeah. One more thing I want to say is when we collect personal information, we have to inform people why, explain to them why we collect this. So your people say, why I collect your age, why I collect your email. So people understand. And then we will emphasize this is information is just within us. We won't share it with anyone else. This is another very important case. Like we collect the age because I work with the seniors. Or the adults, because we have a criteria. So some people don't want to tell their age. And I just say, if you don't have an age, if I don't have your birthday day, write it down, then our funders won't accept it, because we only fund is at like a certain age, right? So I explain to them, they understand. So this is
just out of curiosity though, like, are you asking people for their specific birth date, or are you asking?
We ask birthday. Yeah, we ask.
Oh, I see. Okay, so I guess the question then is, could you satisfy your funders if you were to say, are you age 65 or over?
No.
Okay.
It's because we have.
So again, there's a functional requirement that you have to collect that information.
Yeah, I have to collect. I have to explain to them, and then some people do question about it, so they don't want to. So and
that's perfectly fair. I mean, this is all about informed consent, right?
Yeah, but we also will say sometimes we will just make the easier. It says, I know this is kind of just what we sometimes we see this is kind of a discrimination. Because we discriminate these people is a senior, right? It's an elder person. But based on this is also we will relate. This is called system discrimination. So we have no choice. So we have no choice. Sometimes we fight for this, but just let people understand what those private information we have to have, make people more comfortable. And the other thing is like address. So because actually we don't use address that much, but we have to collect it because the funder wants to know how our clients express how our clients in the community to come to our center. It's like school, right? So you have more people in this area, they may build more school, right? So it's kind of things like this. So now I have to explain to them why we're doing this. We need to know the population about the people living this area, access our services, and then they can put the more funding or not, right? So as these kind of things, people do, when people do question those things, you have to prepare what you can make them understand why we're doing this.
Yeah, I'm always hesitant to collect home address, though with other organizations, like I as a member, I think I'm usually asked for a home address. I guess that one of the mentalities behind that is, if you are committed member and you sort of they want you to be credible, right? to have, like, if you have something, they can come to find you. I guess that's one of the mentalities. But I'm always, and also sometimes if I do sports, like I go to ski, I think in their form they ask for a lot of information, like your height, your age, your home address. And I was asking myself, wow, this is a lot of information.
So you can question them. So why you ask this? Why this is necessary? They see what they explain to you. They do go, because the business people do try to get as much as your information from you. You know that right now it's a data world, right? The data world.
Just as an example, you've probably been to either the LCBO or other stores where they ask you for your postal code, right? They're trying to figure out who their shoppers are and how far they've traveled.
Yes.
And it's not that they're tying that information to anything in particular. They're just gathering it sort of independent of you, but they're just gathering it so that they know sort of where their shopping area is. And what that allows them to do is focus their marketing. So if they're going to, for example, put flyers in mailboxes, they will designate a certain radius around the store and say, this is going to be an effective marketing strategy. This is where we should spend our money, right?
Right.
So, but you have the option to decline that. You can just say, no, I don't want to give you my postal code. Thank you very much. And then you just won't be part of the database, right?
Right. So because I think right now most people knows your information is kind of money. It's worth something. So just make sure you protect yourself. When you have a question, just ask.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's part of the requirement is that we have the facility to answer questions when they come up. So that people know why we're asking for the information. They know that we are going to take care with that information. And if they have questions, they can contact us and ask those questions and get answers, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And Ian, just now you said why personal opinions are listed as one of the personal information. I think in the beginning, like before we recorded, like before we started, Domi also mentioned, like in companies now, it is quite sensitive. You should not ask people whether they're vaccinated or not, or their opinion about whether Trump is good or not, right? So
those can be divisive issues, yes.
So people, and whether they're conservative or liberal, maybe people don't want other people to know. So I think that personal opinions place that. Like,
that's fair enough. I suppose if I was in a position where I had access to that information and could disclose it, then yes, I would have a responsibility to treat it as personal information. That's true. Fair enough.
But vaccine is different, right? It's like a really health related information, so it's not an opinion.
That's one where there's actually a lot of debate right now in policymakers, because there's this whole sort of counter argument about civil liberties and your right to go where you want and do what you want, and whether that should be restricted based on whether or not you're vaccinated or whether you choose to be vaccinated. These are complex questions, and governments are struggling with them. You see that in the division between Quebec, which is imposing a vaccine passport, and Ontario, which is not. So, these are complex issues.
I actually have a comment, because when I originally filled out the member registration, sorry, by the way, it's Dome, I filled out the registration form, and I was really surprised to see so little information was asked. I can understand why now kind of the mentality behind that, because Wang Yan just explained it.
That's
however,
great. Yeah.
I also feel that because I understand that the organization collect all the necessary information, but so if I just feel maybe it's just a comment, like the information that the organization collected might not be enough. For example, like emergency contact. And right now, of course, it's in the Zoom, it's fine, right? You don't need that emergency contact. What if we have like an in-person meeting and something happened to someone for whatever reason, and then there's no emergency contact, that might be put the organization accountable, or I don't know what the consequence might be. So this is one thing I'm thinking of. The second thing is, because as I mean just shared, if for the future, I don't know, when or where this organization is going to move forward. At some point, we might also, apply for government funding, and the government is more about the stats. And then even in the proposal that, sometimes you also need to provide some stats, like, what your clientele look like, your volunteers look like. Even though we don't collect some of the specific like date of birth kind of information, but even the age range or the, members' status, it really depends on where we're going, forward. Moving forward. So some kind of information might be helpful, like if we move forward, for funding, basically for funding. I'm talking about
that's a really good point, actually. And I think that, if we find ourselves in a position where we have an opportunity to apply for funding, and one of the requirements of receiving the funding is having access to more information than we're currently gathering, then we have an operational justification for explaining to people why we would need additional information from them. But I think there's also ways to disassociate some kinds of information from individuals. So, for example, if I were to collect information on people's ages or their age ranges, for example, I might be able to say, we serve a population that is, 15% children, 82% adults, and whatever amount seniors, right? I don't need to know whether you're 25 or 55 to know that you're an adult. I just need to know if your age falls between the ranges of 18 and 65. Right? So I can collect information that is quite generic, that might satisfy that requirement, and doesn't necessarily lead to a specific individual and their age.
Exactly. That's also my point, because know people's date of birth, it's a big kind of big responsibility and also a big burden, but the age range, it's a kind of a generic, so it's
exactly. And that was why I was pressing on that birth date thing when we were talking about it earlier, because you can sometimes satisfy the requirement by saying, are you 65 or older, in which case you're a senior, in which case we can provide service to you. if it's a requirement, an actual functional requirement of your organization that you have a birth date, then you got to get the birth date, right? That's
yeah. Exactly. It's just, I also just have another question. Here's a question, like from the organization perspective. When the personal information is collected, how it's safeguarded. I know that for in some bigger organization, they have like IT, they have to abide by this and that code, right? To put it into this, specific server or something like that.
Yeah.
So, like for EW, sorry.
EAWLC.
EAWLC.
It's a mouthful.
Yeah. So how we're going to safeguard those information, because that's just like a kind of a big liability there.
So right now, I have the access to all the information. Our IT support is another board member. He is in charge of all this IT. He has access to that because it's all online application form. He has. And our secretary is supposed to have all the information, because secretary's responsibility is to keep a copy of all the information. So that's our members' information. The three of us have access. For group mail right now, so everybody who has registered for one or more events, so we have their email address and we put them together in a group mail system. And our program coordinator has access to that too. Because she is in charge of sending out group mail. So that's all. And all of us, after these sessions, we're required to sign that declaration form to certify, promise we need to conform to all this policy.
Yeah, but what if one of your computers are hacked?
Yes, that is that's what we need to think about, figure out.
We freely admit that we still have to work on the breach protocol. That's a piece of the puzzle that hasn't been put in place yet, and that's something we're going to have to sit down with our IT consultant and figure out how to protect that information from a hack and make sure that it doesn't get disclosed accidentally. We're still in process of setting these things up. I think the fact that we've got the policy in place gives us guidance to say, the next step is going to be putting that protocol in place. So we're working on it, is the short story.
Definitely. No, I understand. And I really appreciate all the hard work you guys doing. Really appreciate it. I didn't mean to question anything.
No, that's fine.
That's very good.
Bring this idea and to put it on the table.
That's a very good question.
Thought about it.
That's a very good question, Domi. And do you know any measures other organizations are taking in this regard?
For me, I know some if the organization, they have the capacity, if they have IT department, of course they will be taken care of, as I said, because some of them, they have a special server to put those information. But it really depends, right? So the capacity and how the internal procedure. It's
so it might be as simple as you make sure that all of the sensitive information is housed in a place that has an appropriate firewall set up, so that you require specific access in order to get at that information. It might be as simple as that, and making sure that there's a backup procedure to make sure that there's always a backup copy. Yeah.
And to install all this information in a portable disk like USB.
The hard drive, right? The portable.
Yeah. Also, I really appreciate your suggestions, and I'm thinking we probably really need to put in a emergency contact there. Now we're asking for a member's phone number for emergency use, but yes, we should have an emergency contact information for members as well, because after the pandemic, we probably will organize in-person meetings or hikings or activities. And your suggestion is very good.
I know another organization that I work with sometimes does outings that will take people sort of well out of town and doing things that they would not normally be doing. And we will always ask for an emergency contact just in case something were to happen. We could contact a family member or a friend.
Yeah. So Dongmei, you said you were surprised that we asked for like little information. So what, other than the age group and maybe the first 3 digits in the zip code to show how from which area our members come from, and that emergency contact, like what kind of information would you recommend to in
I think that's I can't right now on top of my head think of any specific information. I think that information asked really depends on the purpose, right? Like say, for example, like in my organization, different programs, they will ask different informations, really depends on their needs, right? So what I meant is, so like I just say some of the information I just listed, like for example, like age range, like people's status, for example, or it really depends on how in the purpose, like I know that EAWL, it's kind of a new organization, but it also depends on, where your vision, where you're going to move forward, and why you're going to do those information, like for some kind of purpose, even in the future.
Kind of program, like for example, if we want to start a program to help like a single parent family, then you probably have to disclose to us like if whether you're a single parent or not. Right?
Yeah.
But again, that's an organizational requirement. Like if it's if it's necessary to know, then it's a legitimate question to ask.
Yeah, exactly.
But you have to be able to justify asking the question. Is the basic principle behind it, right? Yeah. You can't just ask for information for the sake of having information, right?
I agree.
Yeah.
Have
to have a legitimate purpose.
Yeah, exactly.
Does anybody have any other questions or any comments to share? I really like Aiming and Dongmei, your comments, examples, suggestions.
Yeah, guys, thank you so much for doing that.
Wonderful.
Thank you both. Thank you, Ian, for your wonderful presentation as always, and Jan, that's for organizing this event. Wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you for for the lesson you gave to me. I really appreciate it. Yeah. So if like no more questions, then we'll call it the night, right?
Sure. Or if you do think of questions that you want to throw at us sort of after the fact, you can always contact us by email at info@eawlc.org.